The cold wind whispered across the runway of Ouagadougou International Airport as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft orange and blue. Ibrahim Traoré stood silently beside a black government SUV, dressed in a simple dark green uniform. There was no fanfare, just a quiet send-off from a few close aides. The morning felt ordinary, almost too quiet for a man who carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders. As he stepped onto the commercial flight to Moscow, the cabin buzzed with the usual sounds of pre-boarding chatter. Russian flight attendants walked swiftly down the aisle, faces calm but distant. Ibrahim chose a seat near the back, keeping a low profile. A young flight attendant glanced at him, then looked away with a slight scoff. "Passengers aren't supposed to sit there," she muttered in Russian to her colleague, unaware of who he was. The other attendant just shrugged. Neither of them offered a greeting. Ibrahim said nothing. His gaze drifted out the window, lost in thought, the chill in the cabin echoing the frost in their welcome. Something about this flight felt different, like it was the beginning of something. Midway through the flight, the energy in the cabin shifted. Ibrahim sat quietly, sipping water from a plastic cup. The attendants passed him by each time the cart rolled through. No smile, no eye contact. One of them, Anastasia, even laughed under her breath when he politely asked for tea. "He's dressed like a soldier but flies economy. Probably just some African guard," she whispered to her colleague in Russian. From 2 rows behind, an old woman frowned at the comment but said nothing. Traoré remained calm, unbothered. His silence wasn't weakness, it was strength. He knew who he was. Their ignorance was not his burden. Up front, the pilot received a sudden update on his screen. His eyes widened. "We're receiving a direct clearance to land on a private military strip. Special escort waiting on arrival. From the Kremlin?" The captain read the message again, confused. This wasn't standard protocol. Meanwhile, the attendants continued their work, unaware of the storm slowly brewing beyond the clouds. As the plane began its descent, the captain summoned the lead flight attendant. "We need to prepare for a high-level reception. The Russian president himself is on the tarmac. Apparently, someone on this flight is important." Anastasia's face went pale. "What? Who?" The captain tapped his screen. "Name: Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso." The tray in her hands slipped and crashed to the floor. Back in his seat, Traoré calmly fastened his belt. The same attendant who mocked him earlier now stared, wide-eyed, suddenly seeing him in a new light. Her breath quickened. Whispers broke out among the crew. Their earlier arrogance cracked under the pressure of realization. The plane touched down. A black convoy lined the edge of the private strip. Russian officials stood in rows. At the center was a tall man in a long coat waiting. Traoré rose slowly, his presence now impossible to ignore. The cabin held its breath. As the cabin doors opened, the cold Russian air swept inside. But it was nothing compared to the icy silence between the crew and President Traoré. Anastasia, the flight attendant who had mocked him, stood near the exit, her eyes glued to the red carpet stretching across the runway. Guards in long black coats formed a line. In the distance, the unmistakable figure of President Vladimir Putin waited patiently, flanked by military officers and diplomats. Cameras flashed. The air was thick with tension. Anastasia's lips trembled. He was the president the whole time?" she whispered. "Yes," the captain replied, his voice flat. "And you didn't even offer him a drink?" Ibrahim stepped forward. He gave a small nod to the stunned crew, not in anger but in calm understanding. His dignity radiated louder than any words could speak. That silence pierced deeper than shame. Anastasia lowered her head, unable to meet his eyes. Outside, the world waited to honor him. Inside, those who had looked down on him were left humbled. As Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the tarmac, the scene transformed into a diplomatic spectacle. Russian soldiers snapped to attention. President Putin walked forward, hand extended, a rare expression of respect on his face. "Welcome to Russia, Mr. President," he said warmly. Cameras clicked rapidly as they shook hands. A hush fell over the airport grounds, broken only by the sound of a national anthem playing softly in the distance. For a brief moment, time seemed to pause. Back inside the plane, the crew peeked out from the door, watching as the man they ignored received one of the highest honors a visiting leader could get. "He's so young, and yet look at the respect he's shown," one whispered. On the runway, President Traoré smiled politely but remained reserved. He had grown used to being underestimated. But this moment wasn't for revenge. It was a symbol of quiet strength, of dignity rising above disrespect. As the two leaders entered a waiting car, the Russian flag waving in the winter wind, the flight crew realized they had witnessed more than just a visit. They had watched a man turn silence into power. Hours later, the flight attendants sat in the airport staff lounge, still shaken. Their uniforms felt heavier. Anastasia fidgeted with her ID badge, her mind replaying every glance, every moment she had looked down on the man she now knew was a head of state. "I didn't mean to insult him. I didn't know," she said, voice soft, nearly cracking. "You judged him by his seat, not his soul," said another crew member. Meanwhile, news stations across Russia aired the arrival. Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré receives hero's welcome, one headline read. Social media lit up with clips of the handshake, the military salute, the respect. Anastasia watched in silence. The weight of her mistake pressed deeper with every second of the footage. But in that regret, a seed of change began to grow. Sometimes it takes being humbled to see the world differently, and sometimes the people we overlook become the ones who teach us the biggest lessons. Inside the Russian government residence, walls lined with flags and golden light, Ibrahim Traoré sat with President Putin in a private meeting. It was quiet, formal, but respectful. "You handled the situation with grace," Putin said, nodding. "Most leaders would not have been so calm." Traoré gave a small smile. "Power is not in how loud you speak, but in how well you listen." Their talk moved beyond politics. They discussed Africa's future, unity, and the meaning of leadership. Traoré's words were thoughtful, his presence commanding without effort. Outside, news cameras waited. Inside, the heart of a young African president continued to impress the world's most powerful men, not with pride, but with peace. Back at the airport, Anastasia sat alone. A message buzzed on her phone. A crew debriefing meeting had been called. She stared at the screen, her mind replaying Traoré's quiet strength. Something inside her had shifted. In the staff conference room, the flight crew gathered. A supervisor stood in front, arms crossed. "We've received a formal report," he said. "It concerns the handling of President Ibrahim Traoré during your flight." The room fell still. Anastasia's heart thudded. "You represented this airline and this nation, and you failed." There were no angry shouts, just disappointment. "You treated a guest without dignity because he didn't look like what you expected." Anastasia raised her hand. I want to apologize, not just to him, but to all those we ignore because of assumptions." The room was quiet. For once, no one rolled their eyes. Even her colleague, who had laughed with her earlier, looked down in shame. The supervisor nodded. "Real growth begins when we recognize our mistakes." Outside, snow began to fall over Moscow. Inside the hearts of those who had judged too quickly, something began to melt. That night, back in her apartment, Anastasia opened her laptop and began to write. Her hands shook slightly, but her heart was steady. "Dear President Ibrahim Traoré, I want to say I'm sorry. Not as a flight attendant, but as a human being. I judged you without knowing who you were. I let uniform and silence fool me. But what I saw at the end, the way you stood, the respect you earned, the kindness you still showed, changed me. I hope one day I can show you I've learned. Thank you for the lesson I didn't know I needed." She stared at the words. They were simple, but they were honest. She hit send. In another part of the city, a team of Russian officials prepared for a state dinner in Traoré's honor, and somewhere in the middle of all this noise, a quiet letter waited to be read. The grand banquet hall shimmered with crystal and gold. Dozens of guests gathered, dressed in elegant suits and gowns. At the head of the long table sat Presidents Putin and Traoré, engaged in deep conversation. Delicate dishes were served. Traditional Russian music played softly in the background. But Traoré's mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking of power or diplomacy. He was thinking of the flight crew, and how moments like that show what the world still misunderstands. A waiter placed a card beside him, a message from the airline. Curious, Traoré picked it up. It read simply, "We apologize. Not because you are a president, but because we forgot to be human." Traoré paused, his fingers brushing over the card. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. That night he raised a glass, not for politics, but for humility. Sometimes the greatest strength is found in the softest gesture. The next morning, while journalists scrambled for headlines, Traoré quietly requested something unusual. "I want to meet the flight attendants again," he said. His aides were surprised. "Sir, you don't have to." "I know," he replied, "but I want to." Hours later, in a quiet side room at the embassy, the flight crew arrived nervously. No cameras, no press, just him, seated calmly. Anastasia entered last. Her eyes were lowered, her body stiff with guilt. Traoré stood and extended his hand. "Good morning," he said simply. Anastasia's eyes widened. For a moment she couldn't move. Then, slowly, she shook his hand. I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know," he said, his voice gentle. "We all learn. What matters is how we change after. No grand speeches, no punishment. Just a moment of grace that left the room in silence. Back in Moscow's icy streets, Anastasia walked alone, her breath visible in the morning chill. But inside her, something had warmed. The world looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. She noticed a janitor sweeping snow off the steps. Instead of walking past, she stopped. "Good morning," she said with a soft smile. The man looked up, surprised. He nodded. She moved on, but something in his eyes lit up. That small act, that small shift, had power. Meanwhile, Traoré prepared to leave Moscow. As he stepped into the plane, the new flight attendants greeted him with warmth and respect, but he noticed someone watching from a distance. Anastasia, standing quietly near the terminal window, hand on her chest. They didn't speak again, but no words were needed. The story had changed both their lives, and the world was quietly watching. Ibrahim Traoré's plane touched down under the golden African sun. As the wheels rolled along the runway in Ouagadougou, he sat in quiet reflection. The trip to Russia had left a deep impression, not just politically, but personally. Outside, crowds had gathered, waving flags and chanting his name. But his mind was still on that simple message from the flight attendant. We forgot to be human. The presidential convoy rolled through the city, past vibrant markets and dusty alleyways filled with laughter, life, and song. This was home, real, raw, honest. As he stepped out to greet his people, his smile was broader, but his heart was heavier, with responsibility, with purpose. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Respect must begin at the ground level, not with titles, but with truth." A week later, Traoré called a quiet meeting with Burkina Faso's Civil Aviation Board. He spoke not as a politician, but as a man changed by an encounter. "I want all national staff trained, not just in service, but in humanity." The room fell silent. "What do you mean, sir?" asked the director. "I mean kindness, respect, humility. Teach our people how to treat everyone with dignity, rich or poor, leader or not." And just like that, a new policy was born. It wasn't about uniforms, it was about values. News of the story had already reached other countries. Journalists wrote of a president who forgave when he could have punished, who chose growth over pride. But Traoré didn't care for headlines, he cared about hearts. One morning, a letter arrived in a clean white envelope. The seal was unfamiliar, but the handwriting on the inside was unmistakable. It was from Anastasia. "Dear Mr. President, since we met, I see people differently. I now greet every passenger with a smile, not because of who they are, but because I want to be someone better. You taught me that without saying much. Thank you." Traoré folded the letter gently and placed it beside his journal. He looked out the window at a group of young students walking by. Their laughter echoed with promise, and for the first time in days he whispered it was all worth it. But little did he know, one final surprise was still waiting. 3 weeks had passed since Ibrahim Traoré returned to Burkina Faso. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when his assistant rushed into the room, phone in hand. "Mr. President," he said breathlessly, "the Kremlin is on the line." Traoré raised an eyebrow, calm but curious. He picked up the call. A deep voice echoed through the receiver. It was Vladimir Putin himself. "Ibrahim," he said warmly, "your presence left a deep mark. Not just on me, but on many here. We've started training for our international flight staff, inspired by your patience, not your power." Traoré smiled gently, his fingers resting on the arm of his chair. "Respect starts small," he replied. There was a pause on the other end, then a surprising invitation. "I would like to host you again, this time with full honor." But Traoré didn't answer immediately. His eyes were set on something beyond titles now. Instead of accepting the second invitation right away, Traoré focused on something unexpected. A school. Not an ordinary school, but one inside the airport grounds of Ouagadougou. Its mission? To teach flight attendants, airport workers, and customer service staff not just technical skills but emotional intelligence, humility, and hospitality. "Let every person who passes through our hands feel seen," he told the team of instructors. The walls were painted with bright colors, maps, flags, and photos of cultural leaders from across Africa and beyond. One photo stood out, a framed image of Anastasia shaking hands with Ibrahim on the tarmac in Moscow. Below it, the words, "Real greatness needs no introduction. It just needs to be felt." Months later, under the radar and without media attention, Ibrahim Traoré boarded a private jet bound for Moscow again. This time, he wore no official suit, just a plain shirt, folded sleeves, and a small leather bag. When he stepped off the plane, Anastasia was waiting at the gate. Not as a flight attendant, but as head of international training for Russian air staff. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. Behind her stood her entire team, each holding a small flag of Burkina Faso. A banner read, "Welcome back, Mr. President. This time, we know who you are." And in that quiet moment, across language and politics, two nations learned something powerful. Respect speaks louder than any title. If this story touched you, please like this video and subscribe. It helps us tell more true, powerful stories just like this one. Thank you for watching.